Chris had always been the type of person who would just keep his head down and get the job done. He had worked the front desk at a small hotel for over a year now, and while it wasn't his dream job, it paid the bills and allowed him to work in peace. The job came with its fair share of challenges, but overall, it was simple enough. That was until he began noticing something that started to eat away at him. He had no breaks. Well, to be more specific, he wasn't being paid for the breaks he was entitled to by law. As the only one working the desk during his shifts, there was rarely anyone else to relieve him for lunch or bathroom breaks. And yet, every single time he confronted his managers about it, they brushed it off, telling him it wasn't a big deal and that he was expected to work through them. At first, Chris just shrugged it off. He didn't want to make waves, and after all, it was just a few minutes here and there. But then, it started to build up. As the months passed, he realized that this wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It was an outright violation of labor laws. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. His managers were acting like the rules didn't apply to them, dismissing his concerns with the same tired excuses. They claimed that the nature of the job didn't warrant breaks, even though Chris knew the law clearly stated otherwise. The frustration simmered inside him. This wasn't just about time off. It was about respect. They were essentially stealing from him by refusing to pay for the breaks he was legally entitled to. One day, while sitting behind the desk watching the clock tick away, it hit him. He didn't have to just accept this. Chris wasn't the type to back down, but he wasn't the type to stir up trouble either. However, this was different. The more the issue festered, the more Chris realized that his only option was to play by the rules. And if his managers wouldn't comply, he'd make sure they did. Chris had spent weeks stewing over the issue, each day behind the desk, feeling like a reminder that he was being taken advantage of. He had done his best to avoid conflict, trying to be patient, but each conversation with his managers left him feeling more disrespected. He had asked for breaks. He had tried to explain that he wasn't being paid for the time he was working when he wasn't technically on break. The response was always the same. "It's not that big of a deal. Just get back to work, Chris. We're sure it's fine." But something inside him snapped when he found out, by accident, that his manager had been taking breaks, but still getting paid for them. One afternoon, while checking a few emails, he overheard his manager talking to a colleague. He couldn't help but overhear the conversation. "Yeah, I'll be heading out for lunch in a bit. Cover the desk for me, and I'll be back in 30, his manager said casually. It wasn't the fact that he was taking a break that irritated Chris. It was the fact that his manager had the freedom to take one, without worrying about being docked pay. Meanwhile, Chris had been working straight through his shifts, never getting paid for the time when he was technically supposed to be on break. The anger simmered within him. It wasn't just the breaks anymore. It was the principle of the thing. If the company had no issue violating the law for him, what else were they getting away with? That was when the idea clicked in Chris's mind. He didn't have to just accept the unfair treatment anymore. He wasn't going to stand by and let his rights be ignored. It was time to take action. Legal action. But instead of approaching his manager with the same tired complaints, Chris decided to approach this with patience and precision. He had learned over the years that sometimes doing things the right way was the best way to get results. So Chris began researching the labor laws in his state, specifically the ones surrounding employee breaks and compensation. It didn't take long before he found that, indeed, the law required him to be paid for the time he was not officially on a break, especially since he was working solo during his shifts. As a front desk employee, Chris was not legally required to work through lunch or other breaks without compensation. In fact, it was illegal for the company to dock his pay for breaks he didn't receive. Armed with this knowledge, Chris realized that he had a legal right to take breaks, and his employer had a legal obligation to pay him for those breaks, whether they were taken or not. He didn't need to argue about it anymore. He just had to follow the law to the letter. Chris took a deep breath, his heart racing a little. He was about to confront his employers. But this time, he wasn't going to take no for an answer. He wouldn't let them get away with it. He wasn't going to just ask for his rights anymore. He was going to demand them. He typed up a formal email to his manager, laying out the legal facts and clearly stating that he expected to be paid properly for every hour of work, including the break time he wasn't given. He included the relevant labor laws and requested a meeting to discuss the matter. When he hit send, Chris couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. He wasn't sure how this would go, but he had done everything by the book. Now it was time to see if his manager would take him seriously. The next day, he received a response. "Chris, I saw your email," his manager wrote. "I'll have to check with HR about this and get back to you. Please continue doing your job while we look into this." Chris stared at the email for a moment. He wasn't surprised that his manager hadn't taken him seriously at first. But now, he had something far more important: the law on his side. The next few days were tense, as Chris continued to work his shifts, but every minute was a reminder that he was no longer going to be silent. He was no longer going to let them get away with this. Chris had sent the email to his manager about his legal rights and the break time issue, but the response had been slow in coming. Each day he arrived for work, there was a lingering sense of unease. He could feel the tension building up between him and his employers. The email was polite, factual, and firm, but it was clear that they didn't want to deal with it. They had hoped he would just let it go. But Chris wasn't the type to back down anymore. His manager, Darren, was the kind of person who brushed things off with a smile and a joke. Darren had always been friendly enough with Chris, but the moment Chris mentioned anything that could potentially disrupt the status quo, Darren's demeanor changed. It wasn't the first time that Chris had seen his manager try to push his problems under the rug, and it wouldn't be the last. But this time, Chris wasn't going to let that happen. Every day felt like an eternity as he waited for Darren's response. Was Darren going to take him seriously? Would he just ignore the legal aspects and sweep it under the rug again? Chris wasn't sure, but he knew he had a right to know. He wasn't going to let his fear of confrontation get in the way of standing up for himself anymore. This was his livelihood, his well-being, and he wasn't going to allow them to undermine him any longer. On the fourth day after sending the email, Chris finally got the response he was waiting for. And it wasn't what he had hoped for. Darren had scheduled a meeting with Chris to discuss the issue. Chris walked into the office feeling a mixture of nervousness and determination. He had made sure to review the relevant labor laws once more before going in. He couldn't afford to make a mistake now. He had to be sure that every fact was clear, and that he stood his ground. This wasn't just about getting a break, it was about ensuring he wasn't taken advantage of anymore. "Hey, Chris, come in, Darren greeted him, his tone trying to sound casual, but there was an edge of tension to his words. Chris could see that Darren wasn't happy to be having this conversation. "Thanks for meeting with me," Chris said, keeping his tone calm but firm. He took a seat across from Darren, who was sitting at his desk, shifting papers around nervously. "Look, I know what you're going to say," Darren began, already defensive. "But we've been really busy around here, and the whole break thing is a bit of a gray area. We don't normally give breaks because of the nature of the job, you know?" Chris raised an eyebrow. Gray area? That didn't sound like a legitimate excuse to him. The law was clear, and he wasn't about to let Darren brush this off with a vague excuse. "Actually, Darren, it's not a gray area at all," Chris responded, his voice calm but unwavering. "By law, if I'm working solo at the front desk, I'm entitled to paid breaks. And when I don't get those breaks, I'm entitled to be paid for that time. It's pretty clear." Darren shifted in his seat, his brow furrowed. "I get that, Chris, but you've got to understand, we don't have the resources to replace you every time you need a break. You're doing a good job, and we don't want to complicate things by giving you time off. I understand that the job can be demanding, Chris said, his tone measured, but that doesn't change the fact that legally, you have to compensate me for the time I'm working without breaks. And I'm not asking for much. I'm asking for what's fair and what's required by law. I've been working long shifts without taking the breaks I'm owed, and that's not right. Darren looked down at his desk, avoiding Chris's gaze. Chris could see that his manager was starting to realize this wasn't something that could easily be dismissed. After a long silence, Darren sighed. Okay, I see your point, Chris. I'll take this to HR, but don't expect things to change overnight. Chris nodded. I understand. But just know I'm not going to stop until I get what's rightfully mine. I've been patient, but I can't keep working without the breaks I'm entitled to. The meeting ended with a firm handshake, though the atmosphere was far from friendly. Chris left the office with a sense of accomplishment. He had spoken up for himself, and now the ball was in Darren's court. The next day, Chris received an email from HR. They confirmed that they had reviewed his case, and they would be making sure he was paid properly for his break times from then on. A part of him felt relieved, but another part of him couldn't help but feel a small sense of betrayal. He had been right all along, but it took this much time and effort for them to do the right thing. The next few shifts passed without incident. Chris made sure to take his breaks, rightfully paid, and for the first time in months, he felt like he was finally being treated with respect. But something had changed in him. He was no longer the person who would just let things slide. Chris had taken control of his situation, and for the first time in a long while, he was genuinely proud of himself for standing up for what was right. The following weeks felt like a slow breath of fresh air. For the first time in a long while, Chris felt like he was finally getting the respect he deserved. The issue with his breaks had been resolved. He was being paid fairly, and the management had stopped dodging his questions. But even as things seemed to be returning to normal, there was still a sense of unease lingering in the back of his mind. After the HR meeting, things had settled down at work, and Chris had continued to perform his duties, knowing he had stood his ground. But he couldn't shake the feeling that management was watching him. Every now and then, he'd notice Darren hovering around the front desk, his eyes narrowed as he watched Chris go about his job. There was an underlying tension in the air. Something had changed between him and his managers. And though Chris had gotten what he wanted, there was still a sense of unease. One day, after a particularly quiet shift, Chris sat down in the break room to take a moment for himself. He scrolled through his phone, checking the time when Darren walked in. "Hey, Chris," Darren said, his tone flat. "Can we talk for a minute?" Chris put his phone down, feeling a tightening in his chest. This wasn't a friendly conversation. He had learned to recognize the difference between a friendly chat and the sit-down-and-listen type of conversation. He straightened up, trying to remain calm. "Sure, what's up?" Chris asked, his voice even. Darren hesitated, as though searching for the right words. "Look, I just want to say that I'm sorry about the break situation. I wasn't aware of the law at the time, and I should have done more to ensure you were treated fairly. That won't happen again." Chris nodded slowly. The apology was sincere, but it didn't feel right. Darren's apology came with a sense of resignation, like he was doing it because it was the right thing to do, not because he really understood the issue. Still, Chris appreciated the gesture, but there was a lot more that needed to be said. "I appreciate that," Chris replied, keeping his voice level. "But this wasn't just about breaks. This was about respecting the law and the people who work here. It shouldn't have taken this much for me to get the respect I deserved." Darren nodded. "I get that. I was wrong, and I'll make sure we do things differently going forward. I hope we can move on from this and keep things professional." Chris didn't reply immediately. He was still processing everything. While Darren's apology seemed genuine, Chris wasn't sure if it was just words or if they were truly ready to make things right. Time would tell. But for now, at least the issue was resolved. The following week, Chris received a surprise. A company-wide email went out from HR announcing new employee policies regarding breaks and pay. The company had officially updated its stance to comply with labor laws in every department, and they were offering additional training for managers on proper break scheduling. Chris couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. While it was nice to see that the company was making the necessary changes, it felt like a direct result of his actions. He had forced their hand, and now other employees would benefit from his fight. He smiled to himself. It wasn't about the apology or the acknowledgement anymore. It was about the long-term change that had been set in motion. He had done the right thing, and in the process, he had made the workplace a little bit better for everyone else too. But even though things had improved, there were still moments of awkwardness. Chris felt like his managers were still keeping an eye on him, as though they were waiting for him to mess up. But he wasn't about to back down. Chris had learned something important during this process. Sometimes, standing up for what's right wasn't just about getting your way. It was about ensuring that the system worked fairly for everyone. He had taken on a fight that wasn't just his own, and in doing so, he had fought for the future of everyone who worked at that hotel. He wasn't just an employee anymore. He was a change maker. The next day, as Chris walked through the hotel lobby, he couldn't help but feel proud. Things weren't perfect yet, but they were better. And for once, he knew that he had earned his place and earned the right to be treated fairly. The job might not have been glamorous, but Chris had learned that sometimes the fight for respect and fairness is just as important as anything else. Weeks passed since Chris had forced his managers and HR to confront the issue of unpaid breaks. The workplace dynamic had slowly started to shift. There was a subtle change in how the management treated him. Not exactly warm, but certainly less dismissive. And while Chris had initially felt victorious, there was still an underlying tension he couldn't shake off. The issue had been solved, but the process had been messy, and Chris couldn't help but wonder if he'd ever truly be in the clear. The silence was deafening. His managers no longer seemed to question him about his hours. They weren't hovering over him anymore, and the breaks were finally being respected. Chris was actually getting his paid break times without issue. But the discomfort from the previous months was still there, lingering like a shadow that he couldn't quite shake off. Things were calm now, but the underlying tension never fully dissipated. It wasn't just about getting his breaks. It was about the principle. He had taken a stand, but that took a toll. Chris hadn't realized just how much stress the situation had caused until it was over. Now, when he walked into work, he felt an unsettling sense of peace, and for some reason, it didn't sit well with him. But Chris had made a decision. He wasn't going to let this lingering discomfort rule him. He wasn't going to waste any more mental energy on worrying about the opinions of others or the silent judgment he assumed might still be lingering in the air. The changes had been made. They couldn't take that away from him. One afternoon, as Chris was finishing his shift, he received a message from Liam, one of his coworkers. "Hey Chris, how have you been? Got time to grab a coffee after work? Need to chat about something." Chris was slightly caught off guard. Liam was the type of person who kept to himself, and their interactions had always been brief. They'd worked together for months, but hadn't really developed much of a relationship. Still, it was nice to be acknowledged. Chris agreed to meet him, figuring it would be a good way to unwind after another long day. When they met at the local coffee shop, Chris could see that Liam seemed a little anxious. His usual calm demeanor was nowhere to be found. "Hey man, thanks for meeting me," Liam started, looking down at his coffee. "I don't really know how to bring this up, but I guess you've been getting a lot of attention lately, huh?" Chris blinked, unsure what Liam meant. "What do you mean?" "I mean, all the talk around the office about you standing up to management. People are noticing," Liam continued, his voice lower now. There's a lot of admiration for what you did, but also a lot of whispers behind your back. You've kind of made a name for yourself, you know? And I just wanted to say, well, I think it was really brave what you did." Chris felt a strange wave of unease. He hadn't realized his actions would have caused such a ripple effect. He had been doing what he felt was right, but hearing it from a coworker, someone who wasn't involved, made him realize that his stance had created a lot of talk. He was the subject of conversations, and the idea of people judging his actions, whether positively or negatively, gave him pause. "Thanks, Liam," Chris replied carefully. "I just felt like it was something I had to do. You know, I couldn't just let them walk all over me." Liam nodded, but there was something more to his expression. "Yeah, I get it, but just be careful, okay? You know how things can get around here. People don't always like when someone rocks the boat. You've got a lot of eyes on you now, man." Chris felt a tightness in his chest. Was he being too noticeable? Was he now a target for resentment from his peers, or even management? He had done the right thing, but he hadn't anticipated that standing up for himself would turn him into someone people talked about. "I'll keep that in mind," Chris replied, his voice a little more guarded than before. I don't want to make things worse. I just wanted things to be fair, you know? I get it, man, and honestly, I admire you for it, but I've seen it before. People get nervous when someone like you comes in and makes waves," Liam said, offering a sympathetic smile. That night, as Chris lay in bed, he couldn't help but think about the conversation. He had done the right thing, and in his heart, he knew it. But was it worth the potential fallout? Was he now a target for people's judgment, even if it was from coworkers he didn't expect to notice him? For the first time since everything had settled, Chris felt a small flicker of doubt. The battle for justice had been won, but now he was facing the aftermath. There would be no going back from his actions. He had made himself known, and as much as that recognition felt good in the moment, it also came with a price. But no matter what, Chris knew that he had stood up for what was right. He had fought for fairness, and that was a victory he couldn't take back. The next morning, Chris walked into the office, head held high. He wasn't sure what the future would bring, but he was determined to keep moving forward. Whether people liked it or not, he had made his mark. And that, he realized, was the best kind of victory. It had been a few weeks since the meeting with Liam. Chris had spent every shift since then working diligently, doing his job, but his mind was often preoccupied. The strange discomfort he had felt from the attention, the whispers, and the silent tension had started to fade. He realized that, despite the initial unease, he had made the right choice. His actions had led to positive changes, both for himself and for others who might face similar struggles in the future. But even so, the underlying tension had remained. He had felt like he was constantly under scrutiny, not just by his managers, but also by his coworkers. It wasn't that they were openly hostile, but the subtle changes in the office environment, the quieter, more guarded conversations, were hard to ignore. Still, Chris wasn't going to let that bother him anymore. He had learned a valuable lesson throughout this process. Standing up for your rights was never easy, but it was always worth it. No matter what anyone thought, he had done the right thing. And that was what mattered. The turning point came one afternoon when Chris was finishing up a shift. He noticed that Darren was acting strangely. The usual nonchalant demeanor that Darren carried had vanished, replaced with something more guarded. Chris stood up from the front desk and approached him. "Hey, Darren," Chris said. "Everything all right?" Darren gave him a forced smile. "Yeah, just trying to keep up with everything. It's been a little hectic around here." Chris nodded, feeling a slight unease. There was something different about Darren's attitude, something that hadn't been there before. "Look, I don't mean to cause trouble, but if there's anything going on with me or if there's something you need to discuss, let me know. I don't want to make things difficult for anyone, but I do want to make sure things are fair." For a moment, Darren didn't respond. He just stood there, looking as though he were deep in thought. Finally, he exhaled, looking at Chris with a sense of reluctant respect. "You've been doing your job well, Chris," Darren said. "And I want to thank you for pointing out the break issue. It made us reevaluate our policies, and honestly, it's better now for everyone. I was stubborn before, and I didn't see it the right way. I appreciate you bringing it up, even if I didn't handle it well at first." Chris was taken aback. For the first time, he saw genuine acknowledgement in Darren's eyes. It wasn't just a forced apology or an attempt to smooth things over. It was a true recognition of Chris's efforts. "Thanks, Darren," Chris replied. "I just wanted to make sure everyone's treated right, that's all." Darren nodded. "I get it. And, you might not realize this, but you've made it better for all of us. I'll be honest, I didn't think you'd push back like you did, but you stood your ground, and that's rare." For a moment, they both just stood there in silence, the weight of the past few weeks settling in. But in that silence, Chris felt something shift. He had fought for fairness, and the fight had led to a small but meaningful victory. It was more than just about the breaks. It was about making sure everyone had a voice, and making sure those voices were heard. A few days later, Chris received another email from HR, this time a more formal announcement about the updated policies on breaks. They had officially adopted a new approach, making sure all employees were given the breaks they were legally entitled to, with clear instructions to management on how to ensure this policy was adhered to moving forward. It wasn't just that Chris had won his battle. It was that the company was being forced to change, to do better by its employees. And in a way, Chris had done more than just stand up for himself. He had changed the whole workplace culture for the better. As Chris packed up his things to leave for the day, he took one last look at the front desk. It wasn't glamorous work, but he felt proud of what he had accomplished. He had faced an unjust situation, stood up for what was right, and come out stronger on the other side. There were no fireworks, no big fanfare, just the quiet, solid satisfaction of knowing that he had made a difference. He left the hotel that evening, heading out to meet his friends for dinner. He had learned something invaluable through all of this. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is stand up for yourself and others, even when it's difficult, even when it's uncomfortable. And by doing that, you can create lasting change. As he walked down the street, Chris smiled. The future was looking bright, and he was ready for whatever came next. Thank you for reading. See you in the next story.